From Occupy to Black Lives Matter, from the fight for 15 to Antifa, one could say we are living in the new age of protest and activism. But while marching in the street is an important and vital component to bring attention to a cause, many are starting to wonder what comes after the marching, the signs, and the bullhorns. And if we focus too much on the symptoms and not the source. Peter Joseph, the founder of the Zeitgeist Movement, is looking to answer some of those questions and more in his new book, The New Human Rights Movement, Reinventing the Economy to End Oppression. Tyrell recently sat down with Joseph to discover just what is the central message of the new human rights movement.
First, thanks for having me on, Tyrell. And the book ultimately addresses activism for the 21st century, realizing that we have to start looking at things from a structuralist perspective. And what that means is that instead of this kind of group versus group stuff that we've been seeing for centuries now, where everyone wants to blame some other ideology or party or group, or that's just the general dominant ethic we see in the streets and so on. We need to start thinking about what is forming the social psychology that is emanating down and influencing and effectively creating this group polarization and all the debate and general social warfare that we see. So throughout the book, I basically take a sociological approach and talk about at the root of our social system, which effectively is market capitalism. We could use different terms for that. We're going back really about 12,000 years of evolution since the Neolithic revolution. And we've formed through kind of a geographical determinism in combination with reactions to human nature and so on, this social system. And we're reaching a point where we can transition out of this system and outside of all the baggage that we've been creating, hence the disputes and the tenuous social circumstances we see today with all the social destabilization, ecological decline. So to summarize it without getting too tedious with it, if we don't take a structural or sociological perspective of what our social system is creating in terms of affecting social psychology and culture, we're not going to get very far with activism today.
No, we're not. I completely agree with you. What do you see are the kind of biggest missteps, whether involuntary or otherwise, that activists, young activists, old activists, even and others, looking to change the world for the better? What are the missteps or mistakes they're making? I mean, is it just they need to focus on the root cause more, or what else is going on?
Well, I think you said it. The root cause, as defined in the book, being what I just implied. But I'd break activists into three groups. You have the communicative activists, those that are talking about the problems, exposing the corruption of the world, and effectively 95% of the activists fall in that category. Then you have the kind of protest activists, the people that engage in civil disobedience, that are trying to push things forward, like the historical American civil rights movement, which is very effective. And then you have solution activists, and that's something that I think is limited. We're not seeing many solution activists. We see people pushing referendums and political change, and the Bernie Sanders, and people that are trying to do something a little bit different, but none of it's really focused in the way that it should be. And I think that comes down to just, honestly, a general ignorance. We haven't been taught how to think in terms of sociology. It takes a great deal of compassion. I want to throw this out there. When you look at the world and you look at people that you don't like, or groups that you don't like, that you feel are criminal or inhumane and so on, we want to demonize them, but we have to ask where they came from. And people don't just arise. I mean, there are tendencies for social and psychopathology that have genetic predispositions. We know that. But that doesn't explain the severity of how much social distortion we see out there in the world today, especially with the rise of the Trump administration and all this new xenophobic in-group, out-group stuff that unfortunately is just going to accelerate as things go on. So to answer your question, we really have to focus on the root cause, that being looking at the incentives of our system. And until we do that, again, we're not going to progress very far.
And that's my next question is how do we start doing that? How do, these three groups of activists, or just anyone looking to, like I said, kind of make the world better and start helping their fellow man, because it does all come from the heart first, and I think most people wouldn't, could never argue about that. How do we make that step forward? How should people start saying, I don't like these people over here, got to love them first, but I do want to change the world. I do want to, change these problems and things like that. How do they make that next jump?
Well, broadly speaking, it's focusing on attributes that would change the incentive structure and effectively the social psychology coming from our social system. That's a big sentence, obviously.
Yeah.
I break it down in my book into 5 major transitions. First, you have to move from this, broadly, you have to move from a competitive system to a collaborative system. And in doing so, there's 5 basic things that logically are apparent today. The first is you move from a property system to an access system. We see this today with the kind of Uber phenomenon and a kind of inching into the sharing economy, they call it. It's not legitimately sharing, it's more of a consumer-based renting system. But we see that, for example, if everyone used what will eventually be automated automobiles in an Uber type of context, I use Uber as a brand, but you know what I'm saying, access to a car service, I'm not here to promote Uber, is basically you would reduce traffic and you would reduce pollution exponentially if everyone had a sharing system. So it makes more logical sense technically to have a sharing system which also supports collaborative values. Same goes for open source. We sit in a collaborative, people sit in boardrooms in a collaborative, a competitive environment against other boardrooms, say a cell phone company versus multiple cell phone companies. Imagine what would happen if they were all open source as a sector. And instead of this wasteful, planned obsolescence, inefficient, driven innovation where people are constantly reproducing the same things over and over trying to gain market share from the public, they actually came together and they allowed the public to access that information, contribute to open source, and you ended up with literally a participatory economic system. Now those are two examples. I don't want to ramble too far on, but these are ways we can adjust our society to support effectively the opposite of apathy, the opposite of inhumane behavior. Because at the root of it all is our economic involvement. People forget about that because we're groomed into, I'd say, in fact, advancements in neurobiology have shown that we wire our brains particular ways based on habituation. That's common understanding. And when people are born and they watch their parents compete and they suffer in economic deprivation or extreme wealth, because that changes people's psychology too, they culminate this general psychology and it becomes wired in their minds. And then people behave in these ways, they don't even know that they're doing it. And we have to break out of that. And you have to start changing those structural economic mechanisms in order to do that. I hope that's very clear. Yeah. That's the central message of the book.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, I mean, you're a good example, I think, to kind of give people a good example of that. When did that moment kind of strike you in your life? You're going through your life before Zeitgeist, before all of that, and was this one of those moments where it's like, ooh, eureka, I kind of suddenly realized sharing works better than competition? How did you kind of have that moment in your life where that really hit?
That's a hard thing to pinpoint. I will point out, just so people that don't know my background, I come from, apart from being a musician and things that I'm very loyal to, I think work for personal development as a meditation for me, but I actually came from marketing and Wall Street equity trading. So I've been in two of the darkest worlds that really exist on this planet in terms of what the market system has produced. And I came out of that, especially studying economics and especially studying sociology eventually, and the great thinkers that took a systems approach to the world, the complexity theory, you could call it, people like R. Buckminster Fuller. And it was around, Zeitgeist, the first film that I made, was actually more of an us against them type of piece, because that was still my state of mind. It wasn't until after that I really started to investigate what was going on that I realized that we can't blame groups anymore. We have to look at what's incentivizing things. So I'd say it was around 2008 when I made Zeitgeist Addendum, which all those films are available for free, by the way, if anyone wants to check them out.
Yeah, they're interesting films. And actually, I kind of wanted to ask you this because when you read about, the criticisms of Peter Joseph and your ideas, because that's usually people want to jump to tear down. They'd rather tear down the person than the idea because, it's harder to compete against ideas. But one of the other things I want to ask you about is you kind of, the Zeitgeist movement came on as a massive movement, lots of followers. You had some brilliant, weekends of, kind of music and speech and sharing of ideas. You put out these documentaries. But over the years, apart from the awareness that it built up, a lot of people would say you didn't see much change come out of that, actually. You didn't see, it was kind of people went, but they didn't carry it over. How do you respond to that kind of criticism, whether the Zeitgeist or that criticism in general, where, oh, it's nice to have the weekend and the festival, or the thought, but, where do we actually then see the change step in? Where do we see the action?
Well, people have an issue with group inclusion, I tend to find. Some people gravitate towards groups, and some very much don't want to. They want to maintain their individual identity. And I think the influence of the Zeitgeist movement, and more importantly, the influence of the ideas espoused by it, have been picking up. When we first started 10 years ago almost, no one really talked about technological unemployment. No one talked about the massive exponential increase in efficiency that we've been seeing that really defines our economic wealth. No one really talked about the general social architectural things that I just mentioned earlier in this broadcast. So I think while the movement itself has maintained a pretty steady state over the past 5 years, it probably peaked in its public mainstream awareness, I would say, around 2011, 2012. I don't see it as anything more than seed planting. So I think if you look at public conversation and what's happening in a lot of the intelligentsia out there, whether it's related to the movement or not is really kind of irrelevant, but I think we're part of a larger trend. And it's going to have to take hold, at least to some effect, hopefully fairly soon. I mean, I'll be honest with you, though. I've seen a regression. I mean, I will admit that. With the rise of the Trump administration, I mean, we had two different paths here. We had the xenophobic Trump backwards kind of environment where people want to go back to this closed sense. And then we had this emergence of a more of a social psychology-based position where we wanted to base things on a Norwegian kind of economic policy, such as the Bernie Sanders camp. And unfortunately, we went down the wrong path. As far as I'm concerned. So are things progressing on that level? Probably not. But in the broad scheme, there are a core group of us that do know what we need to do. And I think it's just a matter of time before people realize that the wrong direction has been taken, at least in America.